Okay, today we're talking about part two of the American Spanish-American Wars of Independence in Chapter 8 of Martin and Wasserman. And we will pick up where we left off last time in our discussion of Argentina and the crisis of 1808. I'm Joseph Holbrook, your instructor for LAH 2020, Latin American Civilization. So there had been booming economic growth after 1776 in the Viceroyalty Buenos Aires. By 1800 there were 40,000 inhabitants in Buenos Aires. The merchants and civic leaders took pride in the growing prosperity of their community. Creole militia officers positioned themselves to play key roles in the politics of Buenos Aires. 250 members of the upper class formed a junta in May of 1810. One of the patterns in the Wars of Independence was that the port cities such as Buenos Aires and Caracas tended to be much more friendly to the idea of revolution and independence because they were interested in free trade with the British and with North Americans, whereas some of the older vice-regal cities such as Lima, Peru, and Mexico City tended to be much more conservative. In 1814, Ferdinand VII regained the throne of Spain. This was unfortunate for everyone involved because Ferdinand decided to double down on the absolute concept of absolute monarchy, and he thought he could turn the clock back. Unfortunately, that was not possible. So he closed the Spanish Cortes and canceled the Constitution of 1812 in an attempt to reimpose absolute monarchy. In 1815, he sent an expeditionary force to the Americas under General Pablo Morillo to reconquer the Americas for Spain. Morillo landed at Cartagena and waged a bloody and brutal reconquest of most of Colombia and Venezuela, giving no quarter. He executed the Spanish or Creole patriots as soon as he captured them. The Wars of Independence had reached a stage of brutality. In 1820, liberal politicians and officers in Spain forced the king, Ferdinand, to accept the 1812 Constitution and reconvene the Cortes. The way lay open for the Americas to break definitively with Spain. San Martin of Argentina accomplished the almost impossible task of crossing the Andes Mountains with an army of 5,000 men. San Martin's plan was to liberate Peru after liberating Chile, but his plan stalled in 1822. Along with Bernardo O'Higgins, he was successful in liberating Chile, and Bernardo O'Higgins became the first executive of that country, but San Martin was unable to move forward the process in Peru. Bolivar and San Martin met in Guayaquil, Ecuador for 4 hours. To quote San Martin after their interview, he said, Bolivar and I together are too big for Peru. Apparently they had different ideas about what the shape of Peruvian governance should be after the victory. San Martin, it is reported, wanted to bring in a European monarch. Bolivar did not. Bolivar had designs himself on being the authoritarian president. So, meanwhile, back in the Americas, in Brazil, the independence from Portugal came about quite differently because of the different historical circumstances. The Portuguese monarchy was already in Brazil at the time of, actually as a result of Napoleon's invasion. So Brazilians attained their independence peacefully compared to the Spanish nations. The first European royal house was the Braganza House to govern from the American hemisphere. In 1808, the invasion of the French through Spain on its way to Portugal caused Prince Juan and the entourage of 10,000 retainers to decamp from Lisbon and travel with assistance from the British fleet to first to Salvador de Bahia and then to Rio de Janeiro, where they set up the new capital of the Portuguese Empire in Brazil. This brought many welcome as well as unwelcome changes to Brazil. When his mother died, Prince João became King João VI, and he ruled from the Kingdom of Brazil. In 1815, the Portuguese Cortes recognized Brazil as the Kingdom of Brazil, on equal footing with the Kingdom of Portugal. So, King João VI brought printing presses to Brazil, which was way overdue. New newspapers began circulating. He established 2 medical schools, a military academy, and he expanded the primary education. Brazilians began to take pride in their homeland, and Brazil was also bound economically to Great Britain, as Portugal had been before her. Nevertheless, as the wars of independence spread through the Spanish-speaking countries in the Americas, popular unrest also began to spread in Brazil. In 1817, a revolt began in Pernambuco, with young army officers calling for liberty, equality, inspired by the French Revolution. There also was a strong sentiment of dislike for Peninsulares, or Renoir, who had arrived in 1808 with Prince João. The revolt in Pernambuco was suppressed in 2 months, and 20 of its leaders were executed. Brazilians expressed opposition to the adverse effects of the Portuguese occupation. Another military revolt in 1820 happened in Portugal, parallel to the one in Spain, and the Portuguese Cortes demanded the return of King João VI to Europe. They rightly feared that he might separate from them and become the monarch of a imperial Brazil. So King João returned to Portugal in 1821, but he left his 22-year-old son Pedro I as the Prince Regent of the Kingdom of Brazil. A period of important and political change was going on in Brazil. Many towns and villages formed their own local juntas, similar to Spanish America, and asserted their local autonomy. Delegates in the Portuguese Cortes were opposed to constitutional changes that might allow the Brazilians to rally around Prince Pedro. The Cortes also demanded that Pedro return in 1822, but his response was a famous phrase, "Eu fico," meaning "Yo me quedo," permanezco aquí, I'm staying here. It was in effect a declaration of independence. You notice that the Brazilian flag, which is superimposed in the background of this El Grito de Iripinga, which is the famous moment of the independence of Brazil, you notice that the Brazilian flag has no red in it. Some people have pointed out that red in a flag symbolizes blood that is spilt for the sake of the nation or the independence. And Brazil has no such red. It's green, yellow, blue with some white. There was no blood spilled in any serious fashion for Brazilian independence. Also, you see order and progress, orden and progreso. This is the flag of the Republic, which is a number of years later, but it's also a famous saying taken from the political philosophy of positivism. And here's a picture of King Pedro I. He was quite the womanizer. He had a number of children, and Dom Pedro II ended up replacing him as the emperor. It was the 7th child in his marriage. And this is the moment of coronation in 1831. And here's a map of modern Brazil. You see that Brazil is intact with a number of states, but they're all contiguous. Unlike Spanish America, which is spread out along the western coast of South America. And finally, here's a portrait of Dom Pedro II as a young man. He was elevated to emperor, the third emperor of Brazil, or the third monarch, after João VI and Pedro I, at age 5. Of course, he didn't rule at age 5. There was a regency that ruled on his behalf. But at age 15, he did take up the rule and the governance of Brazil, and by all accounts, he was a devoted and dedicated monarch who was devoted to the well-being of his people and was very well loved. And that brings us to our conclusion. In most of Latin America, the wars of independence were drawn out and brutal, lasting an entire generation, almost 25 years. The Spanish were winning by 1815 in the first phase, but by 1817 the tide turned in favor of independence after Creole leaders began to enlist the lower classes, the slaves, mestizos, and indios. One example would be Bolivar, that he was defeated by Pais in Venezuela and had to flee to Jamaica and Haiti, where he received help from the slave republic of Haiti. And when he returned, he began to recruit the lower classes to fight on behalf of the independence of the La Gran Colombia. Vicente Guerrero was a mestizo fighter for independence in Mexico, who successfully carried out the independence of Mexico against the Spanish. There were undercurrents of class and race war that added a vicious element to the fighting. Excuse me. There were new challenges, such as how to unite such a diverse ethnic populations into a shared sense of citizenship. Most Latin Americans thought of themselves as Catholics, or by their city or region, their state, but not their nationality. They might think of themselves as Indios, or Mestizos, or Creoles, but very few thought of themselves as Mexicans, Colombians, or Argentines. The leaders of the Latin American governments began declaring national holidays and developing new symbols of nationhood, processions, and songs, patriotic songs. So the development of a sense of patriotism and citizenship came front and center as the #1 challenge. In most of Latin America, the economy, including mining and farming, was completely destroyed by over 20 years of brutal fighting. Hundreds of thousands died. Survivors were armed and mobile, with nothing to return to. It would take Latin America at least a century to recover economically from the wars of independence, and then the challenge to create a sense of citizenship was nearly impossible in such a fragmented and diverse society. This concludes the new nations of Latin America, and next week we'll continue with Chapter 9. Thank you very much.